When this bill is law, we will have 100,000 police officers on the street, a 20% increase. It will be used to build prisons to keep 100,000 violent criminals off the street. We will have the means by which we can say punishment will be more certain.
When that's incentivized, the question is no longer whether someone committed a crime. It's not about that now, because we've seen that people framed all the time, because these are the same people who are responsible for determining what a crime is. Peace, y'all. Today's episode deals with the 1994 crime bill and some of the sort of dark, hidden histories related to the devastation that the 1994 crime bill caused. In my humble opinion, it doesn't get talked about enough. So I'll start off with a question. What happens when incarceration becomes an industry instead of a last resort? And specifically, I'm talking about a scandal, a judicial, legal, law-based scandal that became known as Kids for Cash as a result of the crime bill, which led to punishment becoming a for-profit industry. How many of us know about this scandal? Most Americans, I assume, have heard about the crime bill, the 1994 crime bill. For those of you who are less familiar with it, I encourage you to read The New Jim Crow by legal scholar and lawyer Michelle Alexander. The book has won, multiple awards. It, sent shockwaves through the U.S. for a long period of time, maybe a decade or so. And it still resonates. And I think it's like a must read. It's like, it should be part of, it should be part of like, it should be something that every American knows, but too many of us don't. So anyway, if you're interested more in learning more about the 1994 crime bill, read that book. There's a whole lot of other literature. But for those who are less familiar with the crime bill, I will provide a brief overview of some really important points. So the crime bill was legislated in 1994. The bill was written by then Senator Joe Biden, and it was signed into law under then President Bill Clinton.
Unless we do something about that cadre of young people, tens of thousands of them, born out of wedlock, without parents, without supervision, without any structure.
We see the stories every night. Stories of a violent generation of children committing unthinkable acts of brutality, even murder.
The head cheerleader was then President Bill Clinton's wife, Hillary Clinton. She used the language of a Princeton University criminologist, or he studied criminology, but he coined the term super predator. And he used the term to define young black men across the United States. And as a result of this definition, he theorized that if something didn't happen to bottle or to contain these young black men across America, they would ruin the country in essence. And so something needed to be done about this crime-ridden youth across America, and Black American boys were the focus of this target. They were the target. They were public enemy number one. So this professor later recanted. He later changed his mind about this super predator theory. He later changed his mind, but it was after it had been taken up, after the mantle had been passed on to Hillary Clinton, and after she had championed for the incarceration and the locking up and the demonizing of young black boys and black men across the country, using her large platform, using her husband power as the president of the United States, and using their network through folks like Senator Joe Biden, using the most powerful levers in the United States to champion this idea. This ain't history from 200 years ago. This is the last 20 years. The ripple effects are still relevant right now to this day, right? So this is, in a nutshell, these are three very important points related to what the crime bill were and four of the most important people that led to its packaging. Senator Joe Biden wrote the law. President Bill Clinton signed it into law. Hillary Clinton championed it, and it was the work of a Princeton University, an Ivy League school, by the way, a Princeton University professor who coined the term super predator under the guise or with the hopes of containing and locking up young Black boys and men. So for those of you who know all of this, like, thanks for, bearing with me. And for those who are dumbfounded by this information, there's a whole lot of other research and more up-to-date research on these topics that's very accessible. All right. So for those who know, and I think there are far fewer of us who know about one of the most shocking judicial corruption scandals in American history. One of the most shocking legal corruption scandals in U.S. history. And if you know anything about U.S. history and corruption within our judicial system, you know that's saying a lot. So hold on. There were two Pennsylvania judges. The genesis for this scandal that I'm speaking about, as it relates to the crime bill. Two Pennsylvania judges accepted millions of dollars in kickbacks for sending children to privately run juvenile detention centers, right? So what that means is the crime bill set off triggered a wave of privately run prisons in and across the United States, because the crime bill kicked off, such a what we now call mass incarceration, and because the jails ballooned and became overpopulated, so much so that it created a new market, and that new market was filled by private investors and private prison owners. And as a result of that, two Pennsylvania judges were arrested and convicted for accepting kickbacks to fill juvenile detention centers with young children, mostly many Black males, Black boys who were overcharged, right? Some who had committed minor offenses. Many of them had no lawyers. Many of them had no other records or anything like that. And this affected thousands of children. Thousands of children were thrown into these juvenile detention centers just so that these two judges could make millions of dollars. From privately run prisons. How many of us know about this? Why don't we know about this? Yeah. The reason why I decided to do this episode is because, I heard about this story long ago. I currently live and work in Pennsylvania, right? And as a result, I was, in my classroom, I was teaching, and I was doing some work with some educators from Pennsylvania, and I just I thought about this. I thought about this story that I remembered from over a decade ago. And so I asked the class, who are all educators, right? Principals, vice principals, et cetera, teachers. And no one in my class knew about this story. I'm in Pennsylvania. Nobody knew about this story. So because they're smart and they're researchers, they went and they started Googling real quick. And they were like dumbfounded at what they found. And they were like, pissed because they didn't know about this story. So that's really what made me say, let me bring this to a larger audience. Okay. So that's where the thought for this episode came from. What's even more remarkable than everything that I just said is the fact that one of the judges later received a pardon. And guess by who? A federal clemency, which is a pardon. But guess who pardoned this federal judge? Take a guess. Well, I think I would assume that many people would think, President Trump, because there's been a lot of talk over the last few years of the various people who he's pardoned, right? I mean, he's been pardoning folks left and right, like never before that I can remember. It seems like, at least that's how the media, portrays it. But it wasn't President Trump. It was President Biden. It was President Joe Biden. If you remember, right before President Joe Biden left office, he signed a bunch of clemency on the way out. Like a whole bunch of folks were pardoned on his way out the door. And one of these two judges who had been taking kickbacks from private run prisons was one of the people that President Joe Biden pardoned. So the judge received federal clemency, meaning that his sentence was commuted. So he wasn't given a pardon, meaning that his conviction remained in place, but he was granted clemency and he was released from his bondage, I guess you could say. So there's a AP news story that came out in December of 2024. And then I'm just going to read the first paragraph of this news story. And the news story is written by Michael Rubencam, a judge who helped orchestrate one of the worst judicial scandals in U.S. history, a scheme to send children to for-profit jails in exchange for kickbacks was among the 1,500 people whose sentences were commuted by President Joe Biden this week. Biden's decision to commute the 17-year prison sentence of Michael Conahan angered many in northeastern Pennsylvania, from the governor to the families whose children were victimized by the disgraced former judge. Conahan had already served the vast majority of his sentence, which was handed down in 2011. Quote, I do feel strongly that President Biden got it absolutely wrong and created a lot of pain here in northeastern Pennsylvania. This is coming from Governor Josh Shapiro, a Democrat. I know about the story, and I'm still like speechless, like just even presenting it to you and reading the news. Like the fact that this story wasn't at the top of the news cycle speaks volumes. So this is, in a nutshell, some of the dominoes that fell as a result of the crime bill. The private prison industry, the corrupt judicial system, and corrupt individuals who are supposed to administer justice as judges and who have become corrupted as a result of this. And again, we see who the majority of the victims in this scandal were: young Black boys and men. So tonight, I want to ask a larger question. What happens when incarceration becomes an economic incentive? In order to answer that question, I will address using 5 parts. Like I will break it down. I will break down a response to this question in 5 parts. By number 1, I will talk a little bit more about the crime bill and the mass incarceration. Number 2, the mass incarceration that ensued as a result. the scandal that became known as Kids for Cash, number 3. And number 4, the presidential pardon or Biden's clemency. And 5, the bigger question, what does it mean when a country makes economic incentives for incarceration by privatizing prisons, which is what happened as a result of the crime bill and the super predator, spearheaded by the super predator discourse, championed by some of the largest, most powerful individuals in the country, controlling the most powerful levers of government, president, at the presidential level, the senator level, Ivy League institutions, promoting these ideas. Man, part 1. The Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 expanded prisons, incentivized for prison construction, because the prison system as we knew it leading up to the 1994 crime bill wasn't able to contain the new wave of inmates and prisoners. The prison system became overrun, basically. And so it provided incentives for private prison construction. And as a result, if you know anything about American or US economics, private prison industry eventually became something that you could invest in publicly, in the public stock market, right? Yeah. And, this, the crime bill triggered a lot of truth in sentencing grants. So like harsher sentencing, that's when the 3 strikes you're out, sentencing, the harsh sentences, the tougher sentencing, the expansion of police funding, the militarization of police forces across U.S. urban cities, right? All of this was a result of the crime bill. But there's a very important nuance here. The bill was supported by many elected officials from both parties at the time. So obviously this was the result of a Democratic presidency and a Democratic Senate, right? And interestingly enough, many Black leaders as well. The Congressional Black Caucus, their hands are also muddied, dirtied, bloodied as a result of this as well. And at the same time, there were historically high violent crime happening. In fairness, like I can't frame this as something that was happening in a vacuum, right? Like there was an epidemic of violent crime at the time, no question. But critics later argued that several provisions contributed to mass incarceration and disproportionately affected Black communities. And these competing perspectives are important context, right? So in other words, it's important to acknowledge that, yes, there was a lot of crime going on. The drug wars across the U.S. was in full bloom. You had the deindustrialization, which I talked about, which left a lot of, Black and urban communities in shambles. There was a lot of economic incentive for people to involve themselves in the drug trade, right? Because, like a significant part of the economies, especially in many of the urban places, and a lot of the places that were magnets for, the Great Migration and the industrial zones, had become ghost towns and deserted via deindustrialization. And, a lot of the illicit drugs and the illicit drug market filled the vacuum, right? And, so all of these things are happening simultaneously. And so And with that came a lot of really violent crime, right? To be fair. But the issue is the ways in which Black communities were overly disenfranchised and disadvantaged, juxtaposed with other groups who were just as involved in drug use, drug selling, etc. The biggest losers and the biggest folk in the communities who were most affected were, without question, those in the Black American communities, right? So part two, that's part one. Part two is mass incarceration. And I mentioned the explosion of the prison population and the disproportionate impact on Black American communities, the disruption of families, the incarceration, the splitting up families through overcharges. I mean, so many people in our communities were going in and out of prison. It became normal, right? Like young kids, 15 years old, 16 years old, 18, 19, 20. I seen it. I lived through it. I saw it, and it became almost normal. Like large chunks of our communities would just disappear from the streets. And it was almost just understood that so-and-so was locked up, was doing a bid. And if you didn't see so-and-so for a couple of years, for whatever reasons, he or she could have moved to another city or another state. And then they, reappear, and the assumption was automatically, oh, damn, when'd you get out? You must have did a bid. So-and-so did a bid. I seen him. Whether they did or not, but that was the sort of knee-jerk reaction. So you had this disruption within Black families. You had these economic consequences as a result of taking family members out of communities, taking family members out of the homes. And then, the ripple of the political consequences that came as a result of mass incarceration. So, and all of this led to, the institutional decline, right? The decline of our institutions, Black institutions. It led to decline in Black organization and in Black community in a way that I don't think is really talked about enough, right? Part three, the kids for cash. This is far more than just corruption. This is the erosion of society. This is core element erosion. When you have a legal system, and albeit, I'll give you that. I'll give you. This is a case. We don't have a widespread scandal per se. Like this didn't happen across multiple states that we know of. This is just one state, one county that got busted. But we don't know if in fact it was something that was widespread. We don't know. I personally wouldn't be surprised, but I don't know. But the fact that this happened, the connection between the judges responsible for upholding justice, and when you look at this, and you follow the path, when you follow it back to the Ivy League professor and his research as an Ivy League professor, teaching Ivy League students that Black children are predisposed to criminal and violent behavior, and as such, they need to be contained and labeled them super predators. Completely decontextualizing all of U.S. history as it relates to how Black communities, Black children, Black students, how and why they find themselves in the conditions and in the environments that they find themselves in. Not at all taking into consideration that despite those environments, the overwhelming indications or stories of successful navigation and successful cases of young Black boys who were able to navigate an environment and to lead productive lives, not accounting for any of that. So you see the decadence of a nation on full display. Part 4, Biden's clemency. President Biden commuted Michael Conahan's sentence as part of a larger clemency initiative that of over 1,500 people, based on an eligibility criteria that the president knows I don't know. I don't know what that criteria was. All I know is what I know and what I'm presenting to you. But this judge's conviction was not erased, all right? And the decision generated significant criticism from victims, Pennsylvania officials, and others because of the gravity of the, quote, kids for cash scandal. This was a kids for cash scandal. The White House indicated that commutations were based on general criteria rather than an individual review of each case. Whatever the hell that means. This is an article in Politico that talks about that. But, they justified what they did for the White House. It made sense to them. It was ethical to them, which says what it says. Part 5, the bigger question. And this is really sort of the crux of what I want to talk about. What happens when incarceration becomes economically profitable? And we have to be, when we ask that question, it's important to be mindful of the history of enslavement in this country, 250 years of enslavement. The 250 years of free labor, 250 years of dehumanizing. And in 1994, the actors responsible for the 1994 crime bill and the dominoes that fell as a result of that, given that history, what did we learn as a nation? What does it mean to have a president like Bill Clinton, who Black people adored, and yet he be the one to sign the bill into law? What does it mean to have Hillary Clinton running for president, who many Black people supported, championing the idea of the super predator myth that became a myth that the author of the theory later detracted? What does it mean for Black people to support the woman who paraded the idea that young Black men were predestined or predisposed to violent crime and violent criminal behavior, and as such need to be contained? What does it mean to have former President Joe Biden make a Black woman his running mate as president, despite being the author of the crime bill? Should local economies depend on prisons, given this history? Should judges ever have discretion that can be monetized? This isn't simply about two corrupt judges in northeastern Pennsylvania. It's not about one crime bill, and it's not about one party. It's not about the Democrats. It's not about the Republicans. It is about what happens when punishment becomes infrastructure. The thing about infrastructure, maintaining infrastructure, is that it can only maintain itself And it will only maintain itself. And it has only maintained itself, regardless of the party that was running the show. I remember KRS once says, "You were put here to protect us, but who protects us from you?" The question becomes, who benefits from incarceration? And what does that do to justice itself? Is there even a such thing as justice in these here United States? And at what point is reparations the main demand of Black American people in this country? At what point do Black Americans become unafraid to demand the rights and the dignity of our ancestors and what they had endured? What good is our freedom if we're not fighting on behalf of what our ancestors endured? What good is our freedom? What good is our education? What good is our salaries? What good are these things? The ability to run for a local office. What good are these things if we're not fighting for the dignity of what our ancestors had to endure? And these folks playing in our face. The ways in which we think about Bill Clinton, the ways in which we think about Hillary Clinton, the ways in which we think about Joe Biden, and the ways they show us, or the ways in which they've showed us what they thought of us. If you like this content, become a member, like, subscribe, share, and share your thoughts in the comments. That's it for now, y'all. Peace.
Word up, quick to shut it, don't wet it. Real niggas lick shots, peace, Connecticut.
Yo, what up, yo? Time is running out, it's for real, though. Let's connect, politics, ditto.